Okay, well, welcome. We're going to begin today. Going to have to pardon our frazzleness. There's a lot of issues we're trying to solve simultaneously. So there's issues going on in Asheville, and there's many sites around the country, even the world, that are signing in today. Can I just check in with Chicago? Boris, are you able to hear me out okay?
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Okay, good. Very good. I'm going to do a 15-minute introduction here from Asheville. And if we can, we're going to try to go around at the end of those 15 minutes for the group sites. I know some of the group sites are having trouble logging in here right now. We've got people trying to help with that, and hopefully that'll be resolved shortly. There are a number of people on their home computers right now, personal computers around, actually the world. There's a person from England maybe joining us, as well as Hawaii. She's going to sleep in a little bit before she signs in. And they hopefully are having the ability to sign in. A few of those people are having troubles. I've got a technician friend of mine who's going to try to work on those issues as well. So let's talk a little bit of why we're here today, and then we'll go through some of the logistics in just a moment. First of all, I want to welcome everybody, both here locally in Asheville, North Carolina, as well as Chicago, Loyola, and the other sites, which we'll be mentioning in a moment. Today is a groundbreaking experiment that we're trying today. We're simultaneously broadcasting Jungian seminar to multiple sites here. And if this model works, we're going to try to expand that and offer some more programming in other ways also. The Asheville Jung Center is what I'm involved with. We are a group founded here in Asheville about a year ago, and we've had 3 video conferences so far. Those have been with Zurich, Switzerland, where Murray Stein, who's the president of one of the main Zurich Jungian institutes, has led 3 programs for us on various topics. Those include dream work, had one on transference and the therapeutic relationship, as well as the process of individuation. All those talks were recorded onto DVDs and are available on the website, AshevilleJungCenter.org. That should be in your packets. If anybody wants to review those materials we've already done, you certainly are free to do so. There are many, many organizations that have participated today to make this possible. And I'd like to highlight just a few of those people and organizations. First of all, UNCA has been a very gracious host to us. University of North Carolina, Asheville is doing all the behind-the-scenes work. So they've got a fairly complex technological bridge that's bridging all the sites worldwide. They've got a staff that's helped us coordinate this. They were the ones that put up the video web stream test site for those of you who have been connecting to that. Greg Dillingham is the lead person here. I want to thank him personally for doing so much of that work, as well as an excellent staff that he's had here also. The Department of Psychology at UNCA is another sponsor who has been very helpful for us. Dr. Pam Lawn is the chairman of UNCA Department of Psychology, and her staff have organized this part of it as well. From there we move to Chicago, which is the originator of the programming today. That's the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago, a world-class Jungian institute in Chicago. And there are 2 excellent presenters, Dr. Boris Matthews and Dr. Ron Johnson, who I'll introduce in a moment. And they're our presenters today in the seminar. Also of tremendous help is the Loyola University. They are broadcasting to us. So the Jung Institute of Chicago is in a conference room in Loyola University Water Tower campus, downtown Chicago, and they're the ones that will be giving us the presentation itself. And again, there's a lot of technical people there who have been very helpful, Joe Brunner in particular. Who else? We have a number of sites, which I call group sites. We have 5 other group sites. They are around the U.S. who are joining in with a video web streaming. I'm hoping all 5 sites are up and running. I'll be going around in a moment and asking them. First of all, let me give them a technical piece of information before I introduce them. First of all, we gave you the wrong call-in telephone number, group sites, for the question and answer. That doesn't matter too much because you'll still hear the entire seminar, but if you want to ask an audio question to the presenters, you need a different number. That number is area code 919-248-1410. That's 919-248-1410. And now that's only for the group sites. So for the home PC users, please don't call that number because you'll overwhelm our system a little bit. But for the 5 group sites, and I'll name those off in a moment, use that telephone number to call in when we invite you to ask questions. That's the phone number you'll be asking questions to Dr. Matthews and Dr. Johnson. If that doesn't work for you or you can't get it activated, just email the questions and I'll read them over the internet to the presenters. You have that email, I'm sure, but I'll give it to you again. It's ashevilleyoungcenter@charter.net. ashevilleyoungcenter@charter.net. That was in numerous emails. Everybody should have that email. But I'll monitor that from this computer, and we'll be hosting questions both from individuals and the group sites with that. So we have 5 group sites that are joining us. From New York City, we have the Analytical Psychology Club, and Jane Bloomer has been our organizer there, and we're very pleased to have her helping with us. We really would like to develop a relationship with New York City. They're broadcasting from the the Young Center of New York City, and they're joining us from the library there, and hopefully they're up and running. Next, South Bend, Indiana has a group, Dr. Warren Sabilla, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name right because we've only emailed, we've never spoken, but hopefully that's your name, and you've got a group in South Bend, Indiana. Tim Swisher is a friend of mine from Omaha, and he has a fairly large group in Omaha, Nebraska, joining us. And the last 2 are Linda McGuire, who has a group in Charlotte, North Carolina, and Scott Schenk, who has a group in Flat Rock. I know that's only 45 minutes away, but they decided to have their own web streaming group there, and hopefully that's up and running. In a moment, I'll be calling out to see if these groups are able to hear and interact. Briefly, I wanted to talk about 2 upcoming programs, just to let you know. Those 2 programs, one is August 7th, another is November 7th. On August 7th, we'll have our 4th pillar of Jungian psychology. We've had 3 pillars so far. Those are the active imagination, dream interpretation, and the therapeutic alliance. Many of you here have been to those presentations. We have a 4th one, which we'll be doing August 7th, and that's on active imagination. Active imagination is a Jungian technique where an analyst and an analysant will take material, often a dream work or an unconscious image, and work with that material to deepen the meaning of that. They may dialogue with key characters in the dream. We'll do some journaling sometimes with that. They'll also paint, draw, use artistic medium to try to bring forth an engagement with that unconscious material. You have a dream of an ogre one night, and you paint the ogre, or you engage the ogre in a dialogue, or it could be anything. I just made up an ogre, of course. But the persons leading that one are Murray Stein, again, the lead analyst from Zurich, as well as Paul Bruchet. Paul Bruchet, also a Zurich analyst, was in charge of the entire Jung Institute artistic archives for many years. He's an artist himself and has a wonderful ability to engage artistic elements with Jungian psychology. That should be an outstanding presentation. That will be back through our MAHEC organization, but also UNCA, but you'll get emails on that. So we'll have 2 sites, one here at the university, one at MAHEC in Asheville, and multiple sites around as well. Lastly, I wanted to mention the November 7th Young White letters. That is a theater piece that will have a live discussion from Zurich. I'm very excited about this one. It's many of you may know Carl Jung, of course, and Victor White. Victor White was a Dominican theologian, a priest, back in the years of Carl Jung. Carl Jung and Victor White had a very deep relationship, deep friendship, lots of visits to one another from England to Switzerland. They ended up angry at one another and went to their deathbeds and raged at one another over theological principles. Does God have a shadow? What's the nature of evil? And these 2 iconic men were conflicting about this. But it makes for a great drama. We've taken the entire letters, which are very thick, and Murray Stein and others have condensed them into a 90-minute theater piece They opened this theater play in London 2 years ago to rave reviews. People absolutely loved the performance. We're going to repeat it in Zurich. We're going to tape it, make it into a mini movie in essence, rebroadcast it on our network, and follow that by a live 2-hour discussion with Murray Stein from Zurich. That's going to be a Saturday morning, November 7th. We hope to have the same UNCA system lined up for that as well. And again, we'll send out more emails about that, so don't feel like you need to be writing down or memorizing those pieces. Let me go over logistics, and then we'll do a quick around with the sites and then open it up to our presenters. Lunch break, that's the most important, is from, depending what time zone you're in, 12 to 1 Central Time, 1 to 2 Eastern Time. And meet with your host to find out what lunch venues are available. When we sign off, I'll tell the Asheville people what's available. Y'all probably know already. There'll be another break. There should be a handout that has the break in it as well. Again, questions, we do encourage questions, and Dr. Matthews and Dr. Johnson will be breaking every 30 to 40 minutes or so for questions. I'll be hosting the questions, so I'll call on the sites and ask them to give us their questions. Now, if the phone system's not working and we can't call in, this is for the distance sites, email us the questions, and I'll try to pick the top few and ask the questions to Dr. Matthews and Dr. Johnson at the time. There are handouts. You all will probably email those. The sites may have extra ones as well. Do make sure cell phones are off. Everybody probably realizes that, but just double check, because everyone occasionally forgets to turn off their cell phones. I see people busily looking at those. I'm reminding myself of that as well. Please have them to vibrate or off if you don't mind. Okay, I would like, if this works, I'd like to go around to the 5 sites. Chicago we know can hear us. We've already asked them. In a moment, if you've called into that number, the 919-248-1410 phone number, this is just for the group sites. In a moment when I call your site, if you can unmute your microphone to the telephone and just tell us if we're coming across loud and clear and how is the audio and video. Now, if I call your site and I don't hear anything, that means you haven't called into the phone number, and that's okay, but we'll just have you engage with email questions. So first I'd like to call on Jane Bloomer at New York City. If you're on, could you unmute your telephone and tell us if you can hear and see us? Jane Bloomer from New York City. Okay, I'll take that as no. Again, we were having some trouble with the telephone system. Hopefully you can hear and see us without the interactive telephone. If you would, send me an email, and I'll be checking emails in a moment when we turn things over to Boris and Ron. But send us an email if you're able to hear and see. Site number 2 is South Bend, Indiana. Warren. Warren, are you there? Have you called in? And can your group hear and see us? Okay, so that's 0 for 2. Obviously, we'll be doing email questions, it looks like. Number 3, Tim Swisher from Omaha. Tim, I know we had some trouble signing on initially. I'm hoping that's been worked through. Tim from Omaha, have you called into the system? Is it working? And can you hear and see us? Okay, so no on Omaha. Number 4, Linda McGuire from Charlotte. Linda McGuire, have you been able to call in? My guess is there's something down in the system, but I'll ask nonetheless, have you been able to call in or see us? That's no as well. And lastly, Scott from Flat Rock, same question. I'm assuming you're probably not called in yet, but if you have called in, go ahead and unmute your microphone and let us know. We'll try this again at the next break, or I'll wait for the emails, but let me wait for a moment. Scott, can you hear us? Okay, so all we know for sure is Chicago and Asheville. For all the 5 group sites, if you can hear and see me from the video web streaming, please send me an email, ashevilleyoungcenter@charter.net, and let me know if you can at least hear and see us, and we'll do the questions by email, although we'll try again to call into the system soon. Okay, it is my pleasure to introduce our two presenters today, Dr. Ron Johnson and Dr. Boris Matthews. Ron Johnson holds graduate degrees in theology and counseling psychology. He practices in Madison, Wisconsin, concentrating his work with both children and men primarily. Ron is a very holistic practitioner, which I think you'll hear soon. I say holistic in the sense of really trying to work with the broad range of personality, not seeing pathology as so much something to be treated and stamped out, but looking at typological functioning and psychological functioning in the way of how can you engage with a person and work with their strengths in growth. Boris Matthews is an analyst from Chicago, graduate of the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. He has lectured quite a bit up there. When I was doing my clinical training program there, Boris was one of our favorite lecturers. He, many of you don't know this, has a PhD in German, which he received in 1967. And Boris has translated works from original German Jungian texts into English. If you think Jungian work is hard to follow in English, try translating it from German to English. But Boris is quite skilled in that way, and we're proud of that aspect. He is an active analyst in the Chicago community, but also in the Wisconsin. He has practices in Milwaukee and Madison. And again, it is my pleasure to welcome both of you. So at this point, Boris and Ron, I turn over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Steve. Greetings to everybody here. Greetings to everybody around the country. Many thanks to Loyola University for hosting us, and to the University of North Carolina, Asheville, for undertaking the technical aspects of the work. You have in your handout packets an outline of the times today, and then a workbook which Ron will be using particularly. I'm going to start out with some general comments, background about C.G. Jung and his work in psychological type. You did receive a piece of material, a compilation of things from Jung that give you some of his background, some of his access. Now, Jung was concerned with psychological types for actually quite a length of time. He gave a talk in 1913 on the psychological type, and then in 1921 he published in German the big volume called Psychological Types. Now that's an interesting book because the first 9 chapters, I believe it is, are really devoted to the background. Jung says right up front, as you read in the email handout, he was not interested in pigeonholing people, that was not his interest at all. So in psychological types, it's only when you get to the very end, the last chapter, that Jung talks about various specific types that we've come to know, particularly through the Myers-Briggs work. And Jung's reason for that was very clear. He was interested in what he calls a critical psychology. That was the fundamental tendency, and as you've noticed, Jung protests regularly that people have misunderstood, that they wanted to say, well, here you slot people in. No, that's not what he was interested in. He wanted a psychology to organize so much of the data, or the data that is so confusing. If we look around us, we experience people, we get impressions of them, but what really can we establish as a categorization or a way of sorting out all these differences that really works well? So Jung was interested in something other than sticking labels on people. Now, in psychological types, and in the handout that I gave you, Jung does go through some of the history of the human interest in understanding the differences among people. We don't need to go into that. You can certainly read that. The point is that even though Jung's psychological types has become one of the seminal works in psychological typing, it wasn't by any means the only one. There was a lot that went on before him. And of course, then in the first 9 chapters of psychological types, he gives the background from people who, they're theologians, they're artists, who have struggled with these human differences. So Jung wanted to base his work, all of his work really, on, if you will, historical principles or historical documents. He wanted to ground his work in sort of the recorded history of humankind, if you will. In terms of actually then establishing typology, Jung was looking for what I would call a value-neutral way of doing this, so that nobody gets bad-mouthed, nobody gets put up on a pedestal. And in fact, he says in one of the passages in the handout, it's on page 6 of the Jung on Psychological Type, he says, if we want to define the psychological peculiarity of a person in terms that will satisfy us and that other person, then we have to choose what we do very carefully. And specifically, and this is interesting, we must take as our criterion that state or attitude which the other person consciously to be the conscious and normal attitude. So he's really talking about a typology that each of us can say, yeah, that fits me. That fits me. Deep down, that's really the way I operate. And so you can extrapolate that to say that in some ways, Jung's work in psychological type is, to a degree, a psychology of consciousness or a psychology of the ego. So this is an important principle here, that each of us, in Jung's view, needs to have the gut sense that the categories he sets up, or one of the categories he sets up, works for us. Yeah, that's the way I really tick. And when everything else is stripped away, that fits me. These other ones don't too well, but this one really gets it. All right. As you may know, some of you have read this, Jung certainly struggled with Freud, and Adler talked a lot about that. One of the things that Jung points out that is very important, he says, Freud can take can work with a person and describe that person's psychological condition, state, and it makes perfectly good sense. It computes. Yeah, we've all seen that kind of situation now, where somebody can describe a situation, yeah, that gets it. Somebody else can come along, in this case Adler, and describe the same, or describe another patient. Yeah, that fits, but the two don't match up. So what's going on here? And Jung says, and I could describe somebody and come up with a third description, which makes sense. So in some ways, it's like 3 of us watching a traffic accident, and each of us is going to give a different report, but it's a perfectly valid report based on the data that made sense to us. So Jung says, but, he says, I've long busied myself with this question, and finally, he says, I've come to 2 fundamental attitudes. And of course, you'll all recognize what these are. These are the attitudes of introversion and extroversion. Now, there's more to the story, of course, which we will get into in the course of the day. The simplest way, in Jung's view, I think, to characterize introversion is a motivation from inner necessity. All right? So for the introverted attitude, and there's, of course, a lot more to say about it, and Ron and I will be saying more about it. But basically, the inner necessity, it makes sense to me. It really fits me. It moves me. So whatever I do in the world, ultimately, the point of reference is myself. That's Jung's point for the introverted attitude. For extroversion, he says that external factors are the predominant motivating force. So teasing these apart, of course, is difficult because when we look around us, we all think about what's going on with ourselves and also pay attention to what's going on in the world. Now, the result of that is that actually it's rather difficult, Jung says, to identify people's typology unless it's rather extreme. Hence, we have instruments such as the Myers-Briggs in its various iterations and the Singer-Loomis, which is another type inventory, to try to parse, to try to tease apart what actually the psychological type of an individual tends to be. Jung points out, though, that there is a third category, and this is not talked about very much officially. He says we have people who very clearly preference for introversion, other people very clear preference for extroversion, but there's a large group in the middle that he calls normal. All right? Which means it's really hard. They work a little extroverted, they work a little introverted, kind of flow with the situation back and forth, and work pretty well. The other thing that I want to say now, just a few words about, is that even though Jung did not publish anything, so far as we know, after the mid-1930s on psychological type, if you read through a lot of his work, especially the seminars, you will find that he's always referencing psychological type somewhere along the way. It's an ongoing theme in his work. Now, why is it an ongoing theme in his work? Well, it's an ongoing theme in his work, because typology, or introversion, extroversion, and the four functions that we'll talk about have to do with adaptation. They have to do with finding our relationship to the world around us, and to finding our relationship to what goes on in us. So it's adaptation to the world around us, and its adaptation to our own nature. And toward the end of the day, we'll have a good deal more to say about that. But just keeping in mind that the crux for Jung, I think, of psychological type is adaptation. All right. So that's sort of a very fast and dirty background on Jung's ideas here. Now, there is in the Jung on psychological type handout, there's a piece that I excerpted from volume 7, which is known as 2 Essays in Analytical Psychology. And Ron and I talked about this a little bit, so we're going to give you what shall we call it? Dr. Johnson?
A bit of a drama.
A bit of drama. There we go. A bit of drama. All right. So if you've read this, you'll recognize it. If you haven't read it, just listen and see what you get out of it, because it's I think it's informative. So there's this castle out here in the country. I've kind of been curious about seeing what's inside.
Yes, we should do that right now. I see that in the distance. Let's go for it. Look at that. That looks exciting. You never know what's going to be in there. Boris, you ready? Let's go. Let's go. I think.
Well, on second thought, maybe it's private property. I mean, maybe it's off limits. I mean, you know.
I'll screw those second thoughts. Let's just go. I think that's the door entry there. It's large. There's a lot of stuff in there. We need to go and examine that. That looks like fun. There's nobody around. There's nobody to ask. Let's just go for it.
Well, I suppose we could knock on the door and find out.
Well, I think the door's a little cracked. Let's just open the door first and then to see if there's any problem. If there's a problem, I think we can take a left turn or a right turn.
Well, all right, that's good enough. All right.
Okay, here we go. There's the door. Wait a minute.
Hey,
What's in here? There's nothing in here.
well, it's just two big rooms. I mean, look, they're glass cases.
Well, where are the people? Where are the things? Where are the operations? What's happening here? This is rather disappointing. Let's go elsewhere.
Look what's in these glass cases. These look like manuscripts.
They're just a bunch of papers and things.
Papers, my God, look at that. They're beautiful. They're illuminated. I mean, sir, are you the curator over there? Yeah, can you tell me more about, well, take me, who's the archivist here? Can you tell me to him? I'd just love to know more about these manuscripts. They're just, they're so wonderful. And it's the kind of stuff that, we don't have at the university. I can't get to.
Are you done yet? There's other places to go, Boris.
Done? I haven't even begun. You mean you want to leave?
Leave? This is about the boringest thing that I've ever done in my life. I can't believe that you're looking at these full papers. I mean, they're old. They're scrap. You can't. I mean, they're not even in PowerPoint. I mean, what's the point here?
I knew I shouldn't go out with this guy. He always spoils my fun.
Well, I'll sit here and wait if you need. Are you finished yet?
Well, I guess. This is our take on that little piece from Jung. And as he interprets it, as he teases it apart, what he's saying is something about adaptation. The two guys are adapted to each other. They are both, the relationship flows. There's the back and forth, Should we go? Can we go? Is it okay? It's okay. Maybe we should knock. The door's open. So they're really related to each other, and it's a negotiation. The one more reluctant one, the more introverted one, is kind of holding back, a little bit cautious. The more extroverted one says, come on, just open the damn door and we'll go in and see what's in there. Okay, we can do that. So they're taking each other into account. But once they get inside, the more introverted fellow is fascinated by what's there and really loses his friend, loses the connection, loses the relatedness. And the more extroverted fellow falls into a kind of a moodiness. Oh, damn, spoiling the day. We could have gone fishing. That would have been more fun than sitting here, At least we could have gone skinny dipping in the lake, if nothing else. So what happens is that there is a kind of a reversal. This is an important thing in Jung's view, that not all of what operates in us is available to consciousness. Some of it operates out of sight, independently, or unconsciously, but it's still operating. So before going into the room, both were relating to themselves and to what's out there, to the other. Inside the room, that breaks down. The guy who loves the manuscripts is totally possessed by the manuscripts, forgets his friend. What the hell with you, you're going to spoil my fun. I want to see these manuscripts. And likewise, the more extroverted young man gets into a funk, which is his own sense of himself. He isn't connected anymore. So they have this kind of split. And so we've all seen this kind of thing in a relationship, where it's going along fine. You hit a speed bump, and the two people, then they aren't connecting. They can't talk with each other. Everything is getting nasty, moody, crabby, because the not-preferred attitude has suddenly taken over. The introvert becomes possessed by what's out there, taken over. And the extrovert is taken over by his own reaction, to which he doesn't have a particularly good relationship. Now, it doesn't have to stay this way forever, as Ron and I talked on the way down here yesterday. But that's sort of the kind of thing that makes the idea of psychological type so very important in terms of adaptation, in terms of finding one's fit with the world and finding one's fit with oneself. So it's much, much more than saying, well, this is your pigeonhole and that's your pigeonhole, and you're good at this kind of thing because, and you're good at this thing because, and we'll put you in there like a cog in the machine. I'm caricaturing a little bit for the sake of clarity. All right. All right, let's turn it over and have Ron start on your part.
Can we get the PowerPoint?
We can get the
and us on the other side, or are we going to keep North Carolina there?
You're going to have the black screen, and let's, there you go.
And, okay, there we are down. Okay.
Yeah.
So we won't go through all of this exactly, but what I want to bring to the table first is who are these guys? And so who am I? I'm a psychologist, and as you might imagine, in my training as a psychologist, I did psychological testing. And all the testing that I did, testing training in graduate school, as I think is true for almost all psychologists, is essentially pathology-oriented. So among other instruments, I'm familiar with the MMPI and a variety of the Milan and other instruments that look at what's wrong with people. That worked for a while in my practice, but I had a very defining moment with a patient a number of years ago because I had kind of fallen in love with the MMPI and other sorts of pathology-based instruments and assumed, wrongly, but assumed that this is the best way to identify what a person is. So, for instance, I had this young man that I saw, and I had recently read Horney's Tyranny of the Should. Any of you familiar with that? Quite a good little piece of work that she did. And gave that to him, along with some other writings. And he came back the next week and threw the book on the floor and said, I have two things to say. Everything she says about me is right, and I feel worse. It struck me. I thought, how can you feel worse? And because Horney herself says, when asked, and she says sort of rhetorically, well, no, I have told you what is potentially wrong, and how is that going to help people? And she just kind of simply says, well, it will. It will help you to understand what's wrong. So I took a step back from them and began to look at other sorts of instruments, and I looked at the Edwards and a variety of California psychological inventory, other instruments that began to look at personality traits. And a therapist that was working for me at the time introduced me to the Myers-Briggs. And that opened up a whole new field of understanding of what people are and what they bring to the table. As most of you probably are familiar with the MBTI or similar instruments, it is not pathology at all. It is not what is wrong with people. It is what's right with people. And those of you who might be familiar with it, there's a movement now about 10 years old, started primarily by Seligman and Csikszentmihalyi, which is referred to as positive psychology. Now, positive psychology, from their perspective and others, is significantly different from what we're doing. They're really looking at character strengths, which I think is very valuable. But frankly, I think positive psychology is looking at the whole realm of who we are as people, including personality type, to look first at what's right with people. So my perspective has come over the years that the pathologies that we have are a strength to a fault. And you'll see that through some of what I have here in the PowerPoint. You'll see that terminology, a strength to a fault. As Boris and I went through this briefly, he and I were looking at strengths and then strengths to a fault. The strength of the extrovert going and seeing what we have in the castle, the strength. The deflation afterwards is a fault, likewise with the introvert. So that's a little bit what we're going to look at. I would ask you, back to, if you can, Boris, the first page here. I'd ask you to look at yourself as we go through today, because that will be most helpful. We are always projecting. We are always in transference. We are always in countertransference. So ask yourself, how do you feel? How do you think? What do you think? What do you feel about Boris? What do you think? What do you feel about me? Are you bored? Are you excited? Those all are extremely important. That's really the substance of what we want to present to you today, not just information, which is the essence of the data, but the real essence is the essence inside of you of how you interact with it. So let's see. I think this is page 2. We've done that. Now, this is how I look at the dimensions that Myers-Briggs has put together, and I have chosen different words. Now, forgive me, but I think it's a little bit easier to just have the blanks for the moment, so you need a pen, or if you don't choose to do that, that's fine. You can just hear them. My preference of looking at these dimensions is this way. So look at this first as a dimension of energy. This is certainly Jungian. To call, instead of extrovert and introvert, I would prefer external and internal. Secondly, under the dimension or attitude that is usually referred to as judging and perceiving, I prefer this as a dimension of boundaries, namely high boundaries and low boundaries. And then the next two dimensions are dimensions of function. My preference for this would be objective, both in the perceiving and in the judging, objective, and in the perceiving and judging on the other side of the dimension, subjective. So what you have here in the Johnson perspective of this is really just a reframing of what Briggs-Myers has done, but again, external, internal on the thought, high and low boundaries, objective and subjective perception, then objective and subjective judgment. Now, the Jung-Myers, or of course it's predominantly Elizabeth Briggs-Myers perspective, is as we would have with Jung. The terminologies then are extrovert and introvert, judging and perceptive, sensing and intuitive, and of course thinking and feeling. I'll go through that once more, sort of race through that if you will. Extrovert and introvert, judging and perceptive, sensing and intuitive, thinking and feeling. The title of this, by the way, which should be their Jung-Myers terminology. The reason, if I might just go back, the reason I prefer my, if you will, terminology on this is because the Jung-Myers terminology, I think, is too easily misunderstood. For instance, if we look at the boundary dimension or the boundary attitude, when you see the word judging, it is often interpreted as judgmental, which of course it is not. Or on the perceiving side, that you're more perceptive, which is not necessarily accurate. Even more, I have even more concern about the function definitions, namely sensing and intuitive. What does it mean to be sensing? Does that mean you're more sensitive? Or on the intuitive, does that mean you're more intuitive, as we would normally use that terminology? Now, I don't propose to change the terminology. I just propose to enlighten it a bit and to say, well, sensing is a very accurate word if you know what you meant. It doesn't mean a person is more sensitive. Or if one is intuitive, doesn't mean that individual is more intuitive, can be, but okay. So, again, next page. So then the Myers-Briggs terminology is this. Those of you are probably familiar with it. What she did, I think, again, perhaps to a fault, and followers have done to a fault, is identify these things much more specifically than Jung himself would have done. And I'm going to turn this back over to my colleague here in just a few minutes by using simple letters and using this sort of terminology. Extroverts are E's, introverts are I's, and so on through what we have here in the PowerPoint that's in front of you. Of course, under perceiving function or judging function, we have S's and N's and so on. There's value and there's danger in this way of looking at it. The value, which is what I see predominantly, it is a beginning way of affirming what a person is. The danger is feeling or concluding that one is exactly this way. So the Myers-Briggs people are really, at this point, we're talking about the Association for Personality Type, APT, will refer rather blatantly to T's are or F's are, meaning thinking-based people or feeling-based people. Now that's occasionally valuable, sometimes very valuable, but equally dangerous. Okay? So the again, the dimensions from Myers-Briggs terminology, as those of you who are familiar with that. We have an energy dimension. We have two function dimensions, that of perception and judgment, and ultimately we have a boundary dimension. I'd like you to look at that briefly and realize that the last two identifiers under the boundary dimension are what we have in the two functions. In other words, we have a judging function and we have a perceiving function. So if one, say, on this Myers-Briggs terminology is what we call a P, or a perceptive, that probably would mean that that individual's dominant function then is in the perceiving dimension. Okay? Let me just fill this in just a bit with you. Again, this is really coming at this from a rather Myers-Briggs approach rather than a Jungian approach, and Boris will sort of correct this. The primary terminology includes all four dimensions. Letters represent these dimensions. Combinations of these letters are predominantly true, like SFs or INFP or the rest of it. Personality type is then represented by four letters, which represent one side of each of the four dimensions, and hence there are 16 possible combinations. Secondary terminology includes, as I have here, SFs or STs or NFs or the other two-letter combinations, and can be very valuable. The other combinations are letter combinations and can be very valuable. The other combinations are letter combinations and can be very valuable. The other combinations are.
Somebody has their mic on.
All right, let me go on. And then these, over the last 25 or 30 years, Kiersey predominantly and some other people have begun to talk about temperament. Now, Kiersey adopts temperament from the Greek philosopher Galen, who talked about four different temperaments, and he has identified these as SF, SJ, and so on, which you are probably somewhat familiar with. These two phenomena, both looking at all four letters or the so-called temperament, have dominated association for personality type and is very valuable, but also I think there are some significant limitations to them. For what it's worth, the organizations that are predominantly MBTI oriented are those that I have at the bottom there: Association of Personality Type, Center for Applications of Personality Type, and the Journal of Personality Type. Do we have time here for me to do a bit more, or shall we take a bit of a break?
Well,
I can.
How much more would you like to do?
Well, I would like to. Let me do about 5 minutes more. Okay, and then we'll have a conversation. Okay, let's look at the next page then. And first, my intention here is to look at strengths of these, and then eventually limitations. Notice the limitations are not weaknesses, but of course they certainly are if we look at that. So the strengths of extroverts, or externals as I would say, are being outgoing and expressive. Note, however, that both Jung and Myers-Briggs would suggest the terminology prefer to be. They would say this is one's preference. As Boris said earlier in our conversation here, that you have a person that prefers to be introverted or prefers to be sensing. So I think it's a valuable terminology. It's a little easier to just say that they tend to be outgoing and expressive. Their preference is for the visible. Extroverts usually talk, and their talk is usually about themselves, and they are public. As you might imagine, introverts tend to be, or prefer to be, ingoing and contemplative. I chose contemplative. You could choose a number of other words. Their preference is for the invisible. They usually listen, and when they talk about someone or something else. And they tend to be private. Right? Strengths of people who might be judgers, if you will, or in my perception, could be high boundary people or low boundary people. Judges or high boundary people value rules and boundaries. In my mind, that's probably the central theme of this dimension. They value rules and boundaries. They see rules as necessary. Just an addendum to that. They see rules as necessary because if we don't have rules, their perception is we have chaos. Hence, they're planful, orderly, and structure-oriented. Perceivers, if you will, or Ps, or in my mind, low boundary people, challenge rules. Now, just a moment on that. Notice the difference between people who tend to be those of high boundary or judgers. They value rules compared to Ps, if you will, or low boundary people who challenge them. Just a moment's digression. Notice how they are both true, right? And importantly, the second note that I have under Ps, if you will, or low boundary people, is they see rules as artificial. So, are rules necessary or are they artificial? They're both. We have to have rules. If we don't have rules, we have chaos. But they're all artificial. Well, we've learned today that the rules that we had set up for this streaming are not working, right? So they're artificial. Or how many of you drove the exact speed limit getting here today? I would suggest probably nobody. Especially if you're in Chicago, you were probably driving at 5 miles an hour. So at any rate, the value of this dimension as the other dimensions is that they're both valuable. Rules are necessary and they're all artificial. Now, I will, in my practice, interpret the MBTI or look at one's personality type, and I will talk to, say, a high judger, which I, again, would prefer to say the person of high boundary, and I would say, well, you are a person of high boundary, and rules are necessary. Yes, they absolutely are. I want you to also know that rules are artificial. Well, what do you mean by that? We have to have rules. Yes, we do have to have rules, but they're all artificial. Well, that's all fine and good, but we have to have rules. So what I have in that situation, as I'm sure you have seen as well, is people then see their own perspective of what they are and see that as the only way. Okay, back to this, if you will, Boris. So the other thing that I would say about perceivers of low-boundary people is that they're spontaneous. Skip the next one, and they are freedom-oriented. So we're halfway through, and now the next two pages, we're going to be looking at the two functions, okay? The perceiving function is this. Sensors, or again, people that I would prefer to call objective in their perceiving, are property-oriented. They are looking for objective reality. They tend to be doers. They tend to work, and they tend to produce. Property, objective reality, doing, working, producing. Intuitives, or ends, if you will, or subjective people in their perception. Yes, good question. The question that has come to me is, what do I mean by property? I'll take a digression on this because it is so very, very important. I think sensing people in their orientation to property are very often misunderstood. A property orientation is seeing what I conceive to be the spiritual value of property. Sensing people do not just see a bottle of water as something to be used. They see the bottle of water as having intrinsic, and my preference would be spiritual quality to it. Very important question. Not something, by the way, most intuitives grasp. It can look like materialism, which of course it certainly can be, but we'll get to the strength to a fault in a bit. So the property orientation is real important. Intuitives, or people in what I call subjective perception, prefer ideas. Subjective reality. Now, of course, sensing-based people will say we're looking at reality, but I would say they're looking at objective reality. and intuitives would look at subjective. I can do this. I can say that the very fact that you ask that question suggests that you are a person of subjective reality. That's always been my experience, that the very questioning of that is, what does that mean? So while I appreciate your question, I want to defer the answer to that to a later time when we can look at that very sort of thing. She says, what do you mean by subjective? Well, what does that mean? It means she's curious. She's looking at, unpack that word a little bit, and then unpack objective a little bit. Right now I'm not certain of that, but I would suspect that. I would say in addition, intuitives are dreaming, playing, and creative. Now, sensing people or objective people can do a good deal of playing, and they can do a good deal of creating as well. But to compare sensing to so-called intuitives, in my mind, predominantly is comparing producing with creating. Which is better? Well, you probably inside have an answer to that. But I would suggest that they're both good. And finally, at least for our present thinking, the judging dimension, the second function. First gather information, correct? Then I evaluate the information. If I'm a perceiver, I'm going to gather. If I'm a judger, I'm going to gather, evaluate. Okay? So on the judging dimension, we do it in what Juden said was a thinking way or a feeling way. I think these words are very unfortunate for the following reasons, and we'll get to that in a second. Thinkers tend to be fact-based, and let me skip down to the feelers. Feelers tend to be, and I have it in quotation, feeling-based, which I'll explain in just a second. Back to thinkers. Yes?
I'm just wondering if there was the first on the line of thinkers is an F instead of a T, and I was just wondering if that might have given us...
Thank you very much.
Oh,
Thank you.
I'm not pointing out a typo. I was pointing out whether or not there might be a psychological...
Yes, that was probably a projection of mine, right? Thank you very much for that correction. That is, that should be a T instead of an F, right? Let me finish with the thinkers. They are truth-oriented, interested in logic and fairness, and they are justice-oriented. Most importantly, to get to the previous things, truth, logic, fairness, and justice, they need to disregard feelings. Disregard their own feelings, which is very important. Disregard other people's feelings, which is, of course, interpersonally interesting. Feelers, or my preference would be people that make a judgment in a subjective way, are feeling-oriented. Now, what does that mean? Thank you. That means, in my mind, intuition. So that would be the next word, intuition. Feeling people tend to say, I just feel, or I just know. I just feel this is right, or I just know this is right. The next line, I would put truth, but self-oriented truth. What is true in my judgment, in my feeling, in my intuition? Even though thinkers are supposedly truth-oriented, theirs is an objective truth. Feeling people are looking for as subjective truth. Under that, harmony, and then finally, mercy-oriented. This would be compared to justice-oriented, and they regard feelings, their own feelings and other people's feelings. Please understand what I have just done, folks, is collapsed about a 3-level graduate course into about 15 minutes. So permit me to do that without too much more hesitation and invite your challenge. Those of you around the country and the world, like I have already had in terms of what does the word subjective mean. So what is your pleasure here? Shall we have discussion here and elsewhere?
Yes, let's take a few minutes for discussion. We can start some here, and then Steve, if you'll take us around the various sites for people in other places.
How about if we at least start here?
Yes.
What are your
One who is concerned with drinking water out of plastic bottles. And where would we put that?
Well, let me dare first ask you to ruminate about that before I address the question.
Well, I think it's both. It's both thinking and feeling. It probably depends on your preference. For people that take action, I would say would be more feeling. And that's just my preference, also my personal approach. That's very interesting, the spiritual aspect.
Yes. If I can just address that briefly, that I think is perhaps the least understood dimension that I have at least encountered in the APT family and, for what it's worth, in the Jungian family. To grasp what it means to be a sensing person or a predominantly sensing person. And that's why I have sort of gravitated to this understanding that a sensing-based person or objective in one's perception actually sees within every physical element a spiritual quality. So my first take on answering your question is not the thinking feeling necessarily, but probably the sensing intuitive. That's the best I can do. I'll repeat so they can hear you.
Do you find that people get their classification? They don't like hotel.
Yes, right. I'll address that. She asks when we have, we have interpreted the MBTI to people and they have heard their letters or their personality type, do they like it or they do not like it? Do I state you correctly? I have found, with a rare exception, that I am telling them what they already know and they feel affirmed in it. And so on a rare occasion, I will have people dismiss it. That's quite rare. I will have some people challenge it, and perhaps their challenge is accurate because later we're going to talk about what's called true type and tested type. So the first time I took the Myers-Briggs, I was one particular type, and then I had a significant change on the second time that I took it. That change, I think, occurred because I became more fluent with who I was. I started to acknowledge my nature more than my what I thought I should be, and so on. So that's like it. Do you have a?
I would just add here that for a long time I tried to live according to a certain typological profile, and it did not work very well. I really wasn't able to convince other people. Leaving aside, no, it wasn't that I was saying that I am X, Y, and Z, or whatever. It just living in that way, but it just didn't cut it, didn't go anywhere. So a way long time ago, one of the persons that interviewed me, actually was Joseph Wheelwright, who was one of the authors of one of the very first type tests, the Gray Wheelwright. And he says, "Boris, you're blah, 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 blah." I said, "I am?" It was a great revelation. So it took me several years to metabolize that and turn my way of being around a little bit so that it was more authentic, and then it came to life. Then it came to life, which had not been the case previously. Interesting.
Did I see a question that came up?
Yes, Steve, could you rerun that question? Or whoever's running the...
Yes, okay. I'm here.
Okay,
Sorry.
Steve,
You're running to the front.
All right.
Sorry about that. Obviously, we're trying to...
That's okay.
technical
It
pieces
disappeared
going.
from the screen. It scrolled itself away.
Yes, okay. I've got good news. Hopefully, for most of the sites, our interactive audio is up and running. And I think all the web streamers were flashed a phone number to call in with that, and a number of you have. Now, there's very important, please, the home users, your home PC users that are watching today, don't call that number, because we crash when we get to 7. just the interactive audio. It won't crash the web streaming, but we'll no longer be able to do interactive audio if more than 7 people call in. And we have 5 groups, so that's fine, but if 8 call in, it'll be bad news. So for the 5 interactive group, and you know who you are, that's New York City, South Bend, Indiana, Flat Rock, North Carolina, Omaha, and Charlotte, if we've hopefully gotten you up and running yet. Call in this number if you haven't yet. It's area code 919-248-4142. Then once you're asked for a code, it's 6003#. I'll read that off again. Area code 919-248-4142. Then hit 6003#. And we'll go around in a minute. I'm going to ask for Asheville questions first, and then I'll go down the list, so I'll give you a minute or two to try to call in. And if you can't call in, just email me your questions, ashevilleyoungcenter@charter.net. And that is also true for the home PC viewers. So if you can just email any questions to me, I'll be reviewing that every so often. 2 comments I've heard so far. One is that people can be perhaps speaking louder, watch voices. It's helpful for the presenters to speak nice, clearly, and loudly, myself included. If you can, from Chicago, some people are saying occasionally look at the camera as well, because we're sort of looking at y'all instead of with you. So occasionally, don't ignore the people there, but look at us, the camera audience, too. And okay, so Asheville questions. Anybody in Asheville, North Carolina, with a question? No, okay. I saw a hand go up. Any brave souls? Here's one from Steve.
If you could expand a little bit on what you mean by a spiritual quality when you're talking about the property. Just what does that mean to you? I don't understand. You like that, huh?
And please repeat the question if you can, so that everybody heard, if you could.
Yes, the question is, can you please repeat what I have dared to call the spiritual quality of objective reality or property? That's the best I can do. I can say that, and I'm not sure what it's like there at UNAC, but most people that are in this audience today have an intuitive base, most likely. Most people that are interested in Jung are intuitive, or in my mind, they are subjective in their perception. So to say that there's another way of actually perceiving it in and of itself is very difficult. The reason that we have such things, I think, as fundamentalism is that fundamentalism, in its various forms, whether in Christianity or Islamic fundamentalism, is because this is an objectifying of spiritual qualities. So there's an absolutism among people of that sort. And what we generally have, they may not be all sensing-based people, but what we generally have then is a sort of a putting a spiritual exactness to things that really have a much more esoteric or philosophical nature to them. What I have found with sensing-based people or people in objective in their looking at reality is they look at property as, if I dare use theological terms, as something that God has given us, and that it is our task to take care of it and to value it. Well, that would lead potentially to materialism. That would lead to kind of maybe an OCD of, gathering information and so on, gathering things and property. That doesn't always happen. But the essence of this is that sensing-based people don't look at things as what they can do, what they mean, and their ultimate value. They see themselves. They're almost living. The Native American personality type has been examined as more than likely a kind of an ISTP type. And you would think Native Americans as being very intuitive, very subjective, but Native Americans, by and large, view the ground as having spiritual value.
Gotcha, very good.
They view rocks as having spiritual value. Do I communicate any of that to you then?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Good.
Okay.
Thank you. Let me go to the other sites, then we'll ask if Asheville has one more question before we turn it back to Chicago. So hopefully the other sites are in and have dialed in. What I'm going to do is call each site, and if you would, tell me if you can hear us loud and clear, how many people are in the room, and then ask your question if you have one. New York City. Jane, are you there?
Yes, there are 8 of us here.
Okay, good. Welcome.
Who has a question?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that. You do or don't have a question?
We have one question and we also have one comment.
Okay, good. Excellent.
Ready?
Yes.
Yes, good morning. I have both a brief comment followed up by a brief question. The intuitive, what I've heard of intuitives and how they function, it almost sounds like it's coming from a pie in the sky perspective, when in actuality there must be a deep-seated knowing at the unconscious level for an intuitive. So let me get to my question. Since thinking apparently is equated with being analytical, is it bound to say that intuitive is capable of being analytical? That's my question.
Boris, why don't you address at least the first part of it?
Well,
Please repeat the question, too, if you can.
well,
Well,
yes.
briefly stated, can intuitives be truly analytical?
Can intuitives be analytical? Well, in a pigeonhole psychology, the answer is no. If it's only if a person is only a crescent wrench, he isn't a box end wrench or a screwdriver, So it's not an adjustable wrench either. So can intuitive be analytical? The answer depends upon the development of an analytical capacity. You see, it's possible. Let me give you an example. Later on in the day, I'll give you an example of that, a personal one. Don't want to tip my hand yet. Many of these functions can be improved upon up to a point. You see, that's the thing, up to a point. And later I want to tell a story from Jung that he gives here in this handout. It's on page 17 of the Jung on Psychological Type, but I'll repeat it a little later, which I think may clarify some of what you're asking.
Let me, Dare, to just add to that, we do have somebody's mic still on. Can I ask you to turn that down just for the moment? First, an intuitive is not just an intuitive. An intuitive is always either a thinking or feeling in addition to that. So you don't have a sort of a pure intuitive person. So I think the answer to that is a yes and no, because you have sort of intuitive thinking combination, you have intuitive feeling combination. Both of those can be analytical. So that would be me addressing that. Secondly, if I can just come back to your original comment about it sounds like intuitives are pie in the sky. I wouldn't like to suggest that, but maybe, Boris, you would address any more of the nature of the intuitive, the pure intuitive?
Also, New York, do you have your microphone still on?
No, you know what that is?
Somebody.
That's us. That's feedback.
Feedback.
It's a delayed feedback.
Yep, I'll turn our speakers down then.
If all sites can mute their telephones unless they're asking a question, that'd be helpful.
Okay, I have turned our speaker down and I got the feedback that it was feedback, so
And
thank you. Are intuitives pie in the sky? A well-developed, and this is crucial, a well-developed intuitive function perceives possibilities, relationships, implications, which are, well, if they are relationships, they may very well be real. Connections may be real, although they're not obvious in a visual or auditory or sensation modality. if the intuitive function is not well developed, then it can be rather wild and it can appear to be pie in the sky. But you see, your question also implies, I don't want to say it implies a metaphysic, but it implies a view of reality, which we could spend the rest of the day talking about. But please be aware that to say or to ask if intuitives are pie in the sky does imply something about reality, and perhaps it implies that most of reality or all of reality is essentially observable with our five senses or with the prostheses that have been developed, such as microscopes and things like that. And I'd rather leave it there. I'm going to turn the audio volume back up, the speaker volume here, so we can hear questions from other sites.
Okay, let's keep going with the other sites to check in. Let me ask Charlotte, because we had the most problems in the beginning. Charlotte, were you able to connect? And do you have any questions? So first of all, are you connected? Do you see audio and video, and any questions, if so? And do you have any? Okay, so Charlotte is still out. Let me go to South Bend, Indiana. South Bend, Warren, are you there? Can you hear and see us fine? And if so, do you have a question?
Yes, we can hear you. We can see you just great, and we have no questions at the present time.
Okay.
Thank you.
How many are there, Warren? Can you give us a head count?
We have 7 here in the classroom.
Excellent. Good. Let's move to Flat Rock. Flat Rock, North Carolina. Scott, are you there? Can you hear and see us? And how many people, if so?
Are you there? Yes, and how many people, if so? Hey, Steve, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hear me? Okay, good. There are 5 of us here. And one of the questions that we do have is, how are these related to archetypes? Okay, good. There are here the 4 functions. 4 functions.
And everybody, please mute your telephones, because that feedback, I'm not sure if that's telephone or the audio speakers, but please remember to mute your speakers after asking the question.
Hey, this is Chris at Network Control. If you're going to be on the phone asking a question, turn down the computer speakers as well, because it's kind of like the same thing calling in from like you're talking on television or radio, same concept. So if you could turn down the incoming audio from the presentation on your computer.
Chicago heard and understands. Well, all right. The question,
Doctor Who.
Yeah, Doctor Who. Well, the question about type and archetype is an interesting one. Briefly, I would say that it appears that the 2 attitudes, introversion and extroversion, and the 4 functions are typical ways in which the mind or human psyche works. And that in itself is, the last part of that, is a broad definition of archetype. There are typical patterns, typical behaviors, and typical emotional charges go along with whatever the archetype is. So that in this particular case, extroversion and introversion, obvious throughout time, so far as we have recorded records, and we have plenty of evidence over time, long time, that people have, various people tend to be stronger more typically in a certain mix of the functions that Ron will talk about shortly. So I would venture out on the limb, I hope it's a solid one, that says yes, typology is essentially an archetypal endowment that we can develop. Another question?
I'd like to dare to address the question that just came up on the screen here about the gender relationships to the function, the judging function, thinking and feeling. I think the question was, do we typically have thinking males and feeling females, or is that what's in the hoi polloi, whatever is a relevant sort of question. Let me just sort of speak a little bit to that I know of. The data that's out there suggests that 60% of females prefer feeling function in their judging function, and 60% of males prefer thinking function in their judging function. Whether that's in fact true or not is very difficult to tell because we have, well, I said earlier, something we'll look at a bit later, which is tested type and true type. So in a female genre, there is more expression of feelings, there is more expression of emotion. Does that then mean that they are more feeling-based or not? I think not. I think what we do have is in the female life cycle, especially in childhood, we have a larger freedom to express feelings as they were. But realize, expressing feelings doesn't make you a feeling-based person. To express feelings, you may be fluent in that. You may be gregarious in the business of expressing feelings, but not indeed be in the Jungian type a feeling-based person. And that may generate other questions. A couple of other minor things is, in the culture, however, a thinking-based female or a feeling-based male both have trouble because of the question that is implied here, that if you're a male, you should be thinking-based. If you're female, you should be feeling-based. So I think it's a very relevant question. And you may have something to add, or there may be other questions that result from that. Now, we're still seeing Dr. Who's telephone, so is that correct, or? There we go.
So we'd like to go to Omaha, if that's okay. Tim Swisher, Omaha, are you able to hear us? And how's the quality and how many people are there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Good. We've got.
Turn down your audio speaker while you use the phone.
We've got 10 people here. We have a couple of questions. The first one is one of the participants here would like the presenters to go over page 13 again, if they have time. Did you hear that?
We haven't got there yet. We'll get there.
Oh, okay.
Tim, sounds like they're getting to that later. Is there another question, Omaha? Anything else at this point?
Oh, excuse me, if I was online there. Oh, yeah. That's really putting it lightly, too. Are you there, Steve?
Yeah, yes, we're here. You can go ahead and if you have another question, proceed.
Yeah, well, it's kind of going along with what Ron was saying about, it seems like a lot of feeling types that see themselves as feeling types actually, or thinking types, either way, they get those two functions confused. In other words, somebody really thinks they're a thinking person, but really what motivates them, their energy and their whole value system is based on feelings. And I'd just like to hear some comments on that.
And then I'll ask Boris to add to that. Again, a very, very relevant question. And it is one of the two functions are very often hard to, I would use the word diagnose or identify. And again, we don't want to put people in exact boxes. But you used a word that is valuable here. The judging function is a valuing function. In other words, it's my value system. So, for instance, do I value, if I'm a feeling person, harmony above truth? Or do I value truth above harmony? Now, most people say, I value both of those things. But in fact, most of us value one or the other.
I think we get tired of the experience that there are situations in which we are not well adapted. We do not do well with certain situations. That there is a deficit in our way of handling things, and so it just gets it gets painful. And we say, you know, I got to improve on this. This is just too much, and so we will find ways of cultivating those functions and that attitude, which is less than serviceable, or less fully serviceable than we would like it to be.
In that development, by the way, I would suggest to address your question that development, whether it's if I'm extroverted, my introverted part, or if I'm sensing my intuitive part, that development is painful. It's painful. It is not wrong, it's not pathological, but it's painful. It's difficult to do it. It's difficult particularly to set aside my dominant function because it's so friendly, it's so easy, it's so natural. And not to reject it, but to set it aside and develop other elements.
And part of the pain in that is that it takes a lot more energy. You will be tired. I will be tired. There will be a finite length of time when I can operate out of a less developed function or attitude. There is fatigue. Whereas in the home base, we can go on forever, so to speak.
You use the words as you mature, as you develop. Could you use the words as you individuate?
Yes, we could say as you individuate. I don't want to go there yet. I'll come back to that later this afternoon. Okay, we've got about 20 minutes till lunchtime. Ron, do you want to?
I would like to, if I may.
All right.
Are there additional questions before we go on? Because what we're going to do here would begin with the limitations, which I think is page 14. Is that okay? Can we do that? Okay. If you're with me on that, and you'll give me my PowerPoint again. Next one is, okay, now we talked earlier about strengths. Here are, and we've already addressed some of these clearly, but these are what I consider to be the limitations. And this, when I say I, we're talking about me and the number of people that have come before me, all of whom know more than I do, certainly. If we look first at the energy dimension of extroverts and introverts, extroverts tend to talk too much, especially about themselves. Hence, they are poor listeners. They are visibly selfish. And very importantly here, they lose energy when they are alone or with one person. Now, that is not universally true. It's not true for people that have matured beyond what I would call sort of undeveloped extroversion, but they tend to lose energy. I'm going to skip the last and come back to it in a second. Introverts don't talk enough, especially about themselves. We hit that a little bit earlier. Hence, not talking, period. They are, thirdly, what I call invisibly selfish, or dare I use the word both for extroverts and introverts, narcissistic. They're invisibly selfish. They keep it to themselves. And they lose energy in a group. Okay? We'll kind of quickly go through these because we want to really discuss these before our break for lunch. Boundary dimension. This is judgers or perceivers, or J's or P's, if you will. Judgers can tend to, on their negative side, be absolutist. They see rules as always right. They lack flexibility. They get caught in undue planning. They have difficulty enjoying the moment. And they have a very hard time truly understanding freedom. They would probably get lip service to it, but to genuinely understand it, much more difficult. Perceivers, the dangers of those folks, tend to break down and ignore rules. They can be sloppy. They can be unpredictable. They disregard not just rules, but others' boundaries. For them, since boundaries are all artificial, if you remember, their own boundaries are artificial, hence other people's boundaries are artificial. They tend to be engaging or disengaging. It's a bit like you can't necessarily count on them. They'll engage and they'll disengage in what might seem to be a whimsical way. Next page, again, we're sort of racing through this and then we're going to discuss it. Sensing people, or what I have called objective people, tend to be boring. Boring. They tend to be busy. They tend to lack in ideas and ultimately irritable. Leave that next one blank, if you will. Intuitives tend to have difficulty doing. Sometimes I might even add the word anything, but doing. Dreaming to a fault. Always new ideas. And they tend to be boring to the S's of the world. How could that possibly be, this intuitive group must say, right? Okay.
What they lost to.
Thank you very much. They're lost in ideas. And I left a blank above, but we'll come back to that in a bit. And finally, just on these limitations. Thinkers. Again, I have F's, should be T's. Thank you very much for that correction. Miss the just knowing in decision making, or we might call that intuition. They disregard one's own feelings. We've been about that before. Hence, they disregard other people's feelings. They see only objective truth, thinking that that's the only kind of truth there is. They tend to be factual and then harsh, and their presentation can be cold. Feelers, or F's if you will, tend to prefer or tend to miss the fact element in decision making because they, if you remember, just feel or just know. Don't confuse me with my facts, I already know. They tend to be lost in their feelings. They tend to be lost in others' feelings. They lose perspective. They tend to be open, if you will, and then to be lost in the opening of feelings. And their presentation, unfortunately, is weak. Not saying they are weak, I'm saying their presentation is weak, likewise with thinkers and feelers. Now there are several combinations of these. Again, I mean not to flood you with all of this information, but really for us to have some discussion, if you don't mind. May I? Okay. I like to suggest that there are brilliance and dangers to combinations. And the combinations would be the two combinations of the functions. Okay, that would be the perceiving function and the judging functions. I like to call the brilliance of the SF combination as abiding love for people. Seeing physical, perhaps other needs as well, but predominantly physical needs. Sometimes this combination is referred to as the nurse or the caretaker temperament. They see emotional needs and wants. They may not always distinguish those two, and they are rarely bored. SF people, sensing, feeling people are interested in the visible sort of thing, and they're interested in the emotional. There's not much more than the physical and emotional to them, that's all, and it takes a lot of time to do it. The dangers are they care too much. How can one care too much? Well, if you care too much, you get lost. And then, without knowing it, I think this is an unconscious function. I'd like you to add to this, if you can, in a minute, Boris. They expect others to care as much as they do. And they will end up saying something like, well, I just gave all that I have. Why didn't you give anything? Well, you didn't ask me. Well, aren't you just like me? Well, no, I'm not. I don't care about things. They're lacking a depth of thinking. We might put analysis. And hence, rarely analyze. Now, this is what I identify as what I call the flawed philosophy or spirituality. I might even call it theology. I know what I feel. And to just put a footnote on that, I know what I feel. Does anybody know what she really feels? Or he? Well, their feeling is, I look at stuff, I know how I feel, end of story. The next combination of these functions would be intuitives and feelings, hence NFs. Brilliance is really a depth understanding of ideas, a depth understanding of other people, or others, if you will, and depth of connections with other people. Loving the essence of a person, open and available. The danger here is a lack of depth of understanding of oneself, because the function is so oriented towards other people, ideas, feelings, that they end up looking so much at other people that they may not understand themselves as well. A lack of full understanding of others, even though they look at others, there are elements that elude them, and because they look so deeply and so widely at people, they miss things. Most importantly, I might even put a star in this, difficulty with separations from other people. Separations for NF people are very difficult. They get lost in the other person, and they get lost in ideas. Now, the flawed philosophy or spirituality, I would suggest, of this combination of functions, I know what you feel. Thirdly, and we're half done with this part, if we put together the two functions of sensing and thinking, very objective folks they are, objective in thinking, objective in gathering information. The brilliance is an objective way of life, ability to see things, doing, regard for the facts of life, and perhaps I would put an asterisk along the last one, regard for the whole of a group or society. Whereas we saw earlier, SFs might be especially good at loving individual people, we might say the STs would be loving of a group, and in so doing, disregard of the individual person. Dangerous, hence disregard of feelings, disregard of one's own feelings. Busy, then unavailable, then irritable. Self-inflating. Disregard for the person. Again, regard for the persons, but not necessarily for the person. Flawed philosophy, I know what I think. Finally, and then we'll have some discussion. The so-called NT, intuitive thinking, functions together. Brilliance, depth examination of truth. We're going to see that word again and again. Truth seeking, truth speaking, depth and breadth, both. Skip the next line. Objective examination. The brilliance of the NT person is to look at the information, analyze it, and disregard everything else but the information. Dangers, unemotional. Looking for what is wrong. NTs, analysts, if we would call them that, are the best critics of the world. They're looking to prevent problems and looking to solve problems. Well, when you're looking to solve problems and prevent problems, you're problem-oriented and you're going to be critical. Lacking emotional expression. Disregarding other people's feelings, ideation, and you've heard this word from me before, to a fault. And the flawed philosophy of the NTs, I know what you think. So we have, I know what I feel, I know what you feel, I know what I think, I know what you think. Again, I beg your apologies for giving you a second graduate course in personality types, which has been coalesced into about 10 minutes presentation. But I would invite conversation from you folks, or from those of you who might already be able to identify, had you already not, who you are and what you are.
Start with some questions here.
Pardon me?
Start with some questions here.
Yes, let's do that. Let's start with questions, Chicago, then we'll go to you. Okay. So, questions, comments?
I liked your inclusion of the flawed philosophy, spirituality. I wonder if there could be development of the sort of healthy philosophy.
The question is there a healthy philosophy in distinction to the so-called flawed philosophy? I think it's implicit in the flawed philosophy. If I know what I think, for instance, That is a wonderful thing. I know what I think. I'm not impaired by what you think, what other people think, what I feel, or what you feel. I know what I think. So the strength there is identifying one's thinking. And likewise, I would say of the other combination. I think that's what the strength is.
The flaw and the strength.
The flaw and the strength, yeah. Right.
When you were talking about maturity, I was led to look at all the archetypes on my shoulder, the dominant ones in the front, and as I mature, I get better at selecting other archetypes.
Could you hear that question or comment?
Go ahead and repeat it if you would, Ron.
Well, the question was, as I mature, get older, correct me if I'm missing something, but I get better at, okay, the archetypes are on my shoulder, and as I mature, I get better at selecting which one I'm going to pay attention to, or...
Well, the dominant ones are up front.
Oh, all right.
They're all in the village.
Yes.
And as I mature, I get good at going beyond the dominant ones and selecting the others.
Okay, I get good at going beyond the dominant ones and selecting the others.
Yes. The question is, are there people that are in the cusp of all of these? Are you in between, not distinct on one side or another? Let me say several things. First, when I've seen people's Myers-Briggs, very often they are on one side barely, or they take it 2 or 3 times and they change from one side to another. There are 3 possibilities here, if I can go in that direction. One is that is not a dominant function. So if I'm in between, say, on the S and the N, the likelihood that my dominant function is on the perceiving function, it's probably thinking or feeling rather than that which is right in the middle. That's a possibility. The second possibility is that I have developed both of those functions well. One of them might be an auxiliary, one might be tertiary, but I do both of them well. The third possibility is I have developed neither one very well. Have I complicated life enough with that answer?
Oh, it's a wonderful complication. I love it. Shall we go and Steve go to Asheville?
Yes. Let me ask some of the other sites, and then we'll end with Asheville. And I've got a couple email questions now that we can ask. First of all, Charlotte, I am pleased to report, is indeed hooked up to us. They were the last one we weren't sure about. Their audio connection wasn't fully active. They are dialed in. At least we have a 704 area code phone dialed in. We're going to try to amplify their gain. If we can't hear their question, I have it written out on email. So Linda and Charlotte, let's try again. Are you able to ask your question over the phone? No, okay. There's a gremlin in the phone line between Charlotte and Asheville, but not for the internet. And Linda from Charlotte has 2 questions for us. And I'll read the first one twice because it looks very interesting. To return to S versus I and the spiritual quality of sensing, will you clarify the distinction between valuing the spiritual dimension of objective reality for sensors and the desire for meaning for intuitives? I'll read that again. To return to S versus I and the spiritual quality of sensing, will you clarify the distinction between valuing the spiritual dimension of the objective reality for sensors and the desire for meaning for the intuitives? That's a mouthful.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for that question. I will do the best I can to fumble with the answer for that. But I really want to state that, let me dare do this. The very fact that you asked that question suggests a very important thing to me. It suggests that you're probably an intuitive person and have easily identified the spiritual quality of intuition, ideas, possibilities, and change. To consider an alternate to that might be considering a tertiary or even an inferior function with you. Dare I go that far? To consider that there is a spiritual quality to an objective fact, or more importantly, a simple bottle or a rock, is a huge stretch. When we think of the word spiritual, spiritual to us means esoteric, it means nebulous, it means cloudy. So to put the word spiritual on a rock, or to put the word spiritual on a word, or to put the word spiritual on that clutter in your basement, is a real stretch. But frankly, I think, if I dare say so, in this group, I think it's the most important stretch to make. To get some grasp that I don't get this. I don't even like it. I'm married to a guy that does this and it makes no sense to me. Or my parents used to do that. Or that's the very reason that I ended up in therapy, because I was working for a boss that made me do objective things that were not meaningful to me, and I had to do them. So the best I can say is, to my knowledge, this little piece has not been written about in Jungian thought. Well, Jung himself wasn't intuitive. I mean, he was not going to write about this. So I think it needs work. I think it needs unpack. And I dare say I'm just beginning to be able to do that. I've written a little bit about it. I'm still not yet satisfied. I'm certainly not satisfied with how I answered your question.
Okay. Thank you, Ryan. One piece of feedback. If you can lean forward when you're speaking, we saw your shoulder but not your face. The camera is pointed towards the middle of the table, so when you're speaking, if you can move into the camera a little bit, that would help us. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, now we see. Yeah, right. So, but thank you for that very good attempt at that complex question. I've got two more email questions, and then I want to ask Chicago whether we break for lunch or keep going with the roundabout. I'll let you be thinking about that for a moment. Let me ask these two email questions, quickly. The second question from Linda's group in Charlotte is relates to the handout on two-type terminology. Do SF match up with SP and ST with SJ? Did you get that? Should I read it again?
Got the question. The answer is no. They don't.
Okay.
They're different combinations. SPs are, in fact, that combination of sensing and perceiving was developed by David Kiersey and the temperament group, and they use that as a very defining element of what an individual is. They have 4 temperaments, and SP is one of them. It's by no means the same as SF. You can have an SFP or an SFJ. They can be very, very different people.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And one last email question comes from, I believe it's Miami. Yeah, Miami Beach, Florida. This is from Danila. I may be botching her name. In a woman, what is the difference between animus as ordering factor or activity-oriented factor in her psyche and her thinking function? Let me read that again. In a woman, what is the difference between animus as ordering factor or activity-oriented factor in her psyche and her thinking function?
Well, that's a good for at least another weekend workshop. I guess the first thing I would say is that the terms animus and anima, and I'll make this brief, which is probably not going to be very satisfying. The terms animus and anima are terms that have, over time, come to cover a great deal of territory. Often the territory is culturally defined, or the behaviors are culturally defined. Unfortunately, this is where Jung started out. And so you get the kind of statement which, out of which the question arises. I'll just be authoritarian about it and say the right way, which is Jung's late way of looking at animus and anima, is as essentially empty containers of otherness for what has not been integrated into consciousness, and which also very often is very fascinating and very compelling. Now, I realize that that's a conceptual statement, but if you can get away from the time-bound and culturally defined male and female characteristics, of which there may be some that are biologically determined, and I won't even try to go there. But if you can get away from the very specifics and think of animus and anima as bridges, they are bridges across which can come potential skills, potential attitudes that are not part of our developed consciousness, whether it's man's consciousness or woman's consciousness. And secondly, they carry a very great charge of fascination, positive or negative. And this is something that, we could have a knockdown, drag-out workshop on someday. But thanks for the question. I'm sorry that I can't unpack it any further than that. But it's a good question. It's an important question.
Let me just add that in my much more simple assessment of that, I think the answer is yes. In other words, I think there's a correlation between the thinking function and animus in a female, and if not by any means the same, because they're very different operations, but I think there's a correlation. So in simple terms, I would say a thinking-based female, or NTs or STs, whatever they might be, likely that female has a very active animus function.
Don't agree.
Don't agree.
Mine is sharper.
We're flying in Chicago.
We're fine in Chicago. All right.
Okay.
So now, should we have a discussion at this point, or should we defer that to after lunch?
Well, that's the question I have, because it's 1:05 Eastern time, probably 12:05 your time. We may want to go ahead and break for lunch, since that's what we promised folks. I don't know if anybody has specific time requirements with that. And then we could always catch the questions on the next question break. Is that okay with you, Chicago, or what would you like to do?
What I would like to do that, but I'd like to suggest this. This afternoon we're going to do mostly application of this sort of thing. One of the applications we want to make is the title of this presentation, which is use of type in counseling. So use of type in counseling is basically knowing who you are and knowing who your patient client is. So a precursor to that would be these questions over the lunch hour. Think of who are you, and then think of who are Ron and Boris. What do you think our types are? Similar differences. And then thirdly, who do you like and who do you not like? So you may not want to be as open with the not like as the like, or those of you out there who might be NTs would glad for the opportunity. But at any rate, I suggest that you look at those three things. I mean, what is your type, unless you maybe know it, or test it in true type, and what might be ours, and then we'll look at how we go about making some meaningful application to your work.
Great, thank you. Well, why don't we say 1 hour, so we'll meet back at, 2:10 Eastern Time, 1:10 Central Time, if that's okay.